Hello, Jasmine. Jasmine, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. All right, that's great. Thank you for coming. And
Yeah, no problem.
we're covering an assignment that I have yet to put up. I could have sworn I put it up before, and it's not up there right now. So we're going to rectify that. Um, but I want to give you some context to what's going on amidst the Gilded Age. Okay. So firstly, I'm going to give you this handout, and this is mainly just for reading to give you context to what's going on in the progressive era. I would call the progressive movements era the 1890s and the first decade of the 1900s, personally myself. So when I say the progressive era, that's what I'm referring to, okay? Or the final decade of the 1800s and the first decade of the 1900s. And so generically, right, what the progressives wanted to do is they wanted to improve or solve problems, inequities, injustices that they saw during the Gilded Age, which we've covered already. And so remember, we talked about the big corporations gobbling up all their competitors and a virtual state of monopolies ensuing in the major industries. So Rockefeller with the oil, Carnegie taking over steel, James Duke taking over tobacco, Cyrus McCormick taking over agricultural implements and tractors, etc. And so you see that on an increasing basis, and the progressives were concerned about that. They saw also the fact that in Alan Brinkley's textbook, he states that the average family was earning just under 600 a year, and oftentimes it took just over 600 a year just for subsistence living, as far as the cost of living in many cities in the U.S. And so you had to rely upon multiple salaries in a house just to make ends meet. And the progressives saw a problem with that. They saw the problem with how militant the labor unions were becoming, at least according to the press. And so you had the Great Railroad Strike, you had the Homestead Strike, and the Pullman Strike, and people were afraid, as Gresham had stated from the White House, that we're on the verge of a revolution, like a Bolshevik type revolution of the workers, of the industrial proletariat rising up against their employers and against the wealthy in this country. The presidential election of 1896 was very antagonistic and polarizing, and it made it out to be as if you were for the common suffering person, you would vote for William Jennings Bryan in the Populist Party. And if you were for the status quo and for the wealthy and for business as usual, you would vote for McKinley and the Republicans. And so things were pretty uh, tumultuous, I would say, in the Gilded Age. And so those were the types of things that the progressives jumped into to try to resolve and try to save. And so at any rate, you have court history of them being do-gooders. So you have evidence of them. One way in which, so people differ on what they thought progressives really wanted, what they were really aiming for, but that is the generic safe definition, explanation, is that they were trying to mitigate, make less bad, or resolve what they saw as problems of the Industrial Revolution, right? But more specific than that, some people contend that they were afraid of getting in the midst of a class war. And so that what they wanted to do is they wanted to publicly punish big business and restrict what it could and could not do, give a fighting chance to smaller entrepreneurs, and give a fighting chance to the poor and the working class, because the gulf between them was broadening during the Gilded Age, according to census reports, tax reports, etc. Wealth wealth distribution was pretty stark of a contrast. So according to Howard Zinn and other historians. So at any rate, what they did is they tried to feed hope to the poor. They had settlement house projects here. Jane Addams was famous for her Hull House in Chicago. And they would go into these ethnic enclaves of poor immigrants, and they would provide them childcare, education that was free, vocational training as well to learn a trade. Some of them reached out and connected with employment agencies to try to find jobs for the poor people in their area. They provided a chance for the kids to get off the streets because they adhere to, with sociology and mass psychology and so forth, sciences that were big to the progressives because they were really big on academia, on education, and the social sciences in particular. And so they contended that they didn't want people caught in a cycle of poverty, and they wanted to get them off the streets, give them hope, etc. So you had the settlement house movement as evidence of that. You had muckrakers who were raking up the muck, right? They were exposing all kinds of injustices and just improper behavior, mainly by big businesses. So you had muckrakers that were going after the railroad tycoons and their type of greedy and nefarious dealings. You had muckrakers that were going against the factory owners and demonstrating evidence of them exposing consumers to really, really dangerous products. And so like the famous, right, one of the meat packing industry, whereby the rats were falling into the meat and they were being grinded in with the meat, and just some awful stuff. They were exposing all that. They were exposing dilapidation and urban blight within the 5 points of New York and other areas that were just run down and had nothing but just cycles of poverty, prostitution, criminal rings, etc. And they were trying to get this exposed so that people would become angry enough to demand changes to these issues and these problems. But at the heart of it, right, is I think they wanted to mitigate the problems of class consciousness and class animosity between the rich and the poor. And they were trying to feed hope to the poor, and they were trying to give the poor some sense of catharsis, of being able to, in a safe manner, vent out their anger by seeing big business becoming punished and restricted by bigger government oversight and regulation over the economy. So by and large, the progressives were for bigger government. They were certainly not old school liberals like John Stuart Mill liberals, where there should be minimal government and people ought to be free to do as they please. No, they wanted an order that was more on equity, on fairness, on economic opportunities for everybody, everyone having a fighting chance to the American dream. And they were fine with bigger government involved to do so. But oftentimes with the bigger government, they wanted experts in the various fields to have their hands on the wheel, so to speak. So they wanted people trained in economics, trained in political science, trained in sociology, etc., dealing with those proper fields in government. And what do you know? They were from that class. The progressives were by and large old middle class intelligentsia, lawyers, judges, university professors, writers, etc., who themselves were well educated. And so there was a bit of paternalism involved in this, right? Where they wanted the government to come in as kind of like a father-like figure and hold big business at bay, sometimes spank big business for the country to see, and sometimes intervene on behalf of the underdogs. So we had a couple presidents during this era that contended that they were progressives themselves, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And Teddy Roosevelt is going to intervene in a coal mining strike and neither take fully one side or another, but demand of the big business that they sit at the table, engage in collective bargaining with the union, and give some rights to their workers. And he called it a square deal. But he took that paternalistic stance in getting involved in this strike, which was somewhat unprecedented for a president to do. But it was in the spirit of progressivism. All right. And so they instituted ultimately the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act specified violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act so that big businesses could no longer get away with teaming up on little guys. They established oh goodness, it's eluding me right now, but it was an organization that the railroads and eventually other big businesses had to turn their paperwork into to have them oversee it, to make sure they were not up to no good and engaging in any kind of white collar crime. And I apologize that the name of that organization is eluding me right now. You have the Interstate Commerce Act, which stated that railroad rates have to be the same for everybody, and they have to be reasonable and just. And the Interstate Commerce Commission was eventually given power under Teddy Roosevelt's administration to enforce it and to actually put price ceilings on rates, on railroad rates. And so some progressives even went further to the left and were gas and water socialists, etc., where they felt like some services and goods go beyond the capitalist system of merit, of whether you could afford it or not, and go into the realm of that you are entitled to it as a human being. So like public transportation, medical care, access to water and electricity and garbage disposal, access to education, etc. And so they were very much for a bit of a paradigm shift, if I could say myself, is a bit of a shift from the old kind of Darwinian meritocracy that America had held on to for much of the 1800s, saying, right, that as long as there aren't actual laws like Jim Crow type laws against white people, because of course Black people were just set aside at this time in discriminatory fashion. But as long as there aren't any Jim Crow type laws against you stating specifically that you can't be accepted into colleges, that you can't receive business loans, that you can't purchase a farm and farm equipment, etc., then they said, then the rest goes up by merit. That if you sink or swim based upon your own pluck and luck. The progressives were different. They prided themselves on being more compassionate, more modernized, more nuanced in how they saw the economy and the world, and contended that government needed to do more to ensure opportunities for the less fortunate in particular, and to ensure that it could curb the abuses of big business. All right. And so some people think that they had their own power eclipse that they were worried about. We don't have time to get into that today. Let's see here. I already just mentioned that. So at any rate, moving from the progressives, now we're going to the age of imperialism. All right. So at this time, these ideas, Jasmine, were percolating and throughout academia and through government circles in the Western countries, namely Northern Western Europe and the United States. Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche condemned the present generation as being effeminate, too soft, too civilized, there were other intellectuals who had these cyclical theories about history, that when people were at their primal military origins, that's when they were strongest, that's when they expanded, and they welcomed that type of expansion as an amoral axiom, an assumption that you don't question. And amoral meaning you don't worry about whether it's immoral or not. You just, it is what it is. And so there was a lot of acceptance of social Darwinism, that life is about survival of the fittest, that life is inherently dangerous, that you must keep moving and be aggressive or you will get gobbled up. And they took that, Spencer and Huxley, they took Darwin's thoughts about species, about animal species, and they brought it to the civilization level and applied the same type of assumptions, etc., or very similar ones, and stated that if societies don't progress technologically, militarily, politically, then they're going to die out. They're going to eventually die out because societies will, especially in the industrial phase, are meant to expand and try to impose their will on other people. Then you had Malthus, and Malthus said that he was worried that there were too few resources for too many people in the world, and that inevitably there would arise this Armageddon-like war for scarce resources like gas and water, etc. And Gobineau and Chamberlain stated that different races were going to fight one another. And they classified in science different sets of races at this time that we'll get into. So a lot of these intellectual ideas were just taken for granted during the progressive era. So that the progressives, even though they were for the underdog domestically back here in the United States, right? A lot of the progressives embraced the Darwinian, Nietzschean, philosophical assumptions of their day. They embraced it as being scientific and truthful. Alfred Thayer Mahan said the United States has to become aggressive in its navy. That society, whether it survives and thrives or falls apart, is determined by the seas, by how it does in its foreign policy, in its warfare when it comes to the Navy. So he said it was imperative for the United States to build a new steel modern Navy, which they did with the Naval Appropriations Act of 1882. And they have like the USS, and most of them, the initial ones were named after states. So later on with Pearl Harbor, with the USS Arizona, et cetera, being sunk, those were the same ones that were brand new here in the 1880s, which were state of the art, obviously, 60 years before. So you have Mahan, you have other people talk about the white man's burden and contending that, okay, if you have qualms about militarily taking over a weaker country, just remember this, that if you don't take them over, that developing, quote, third world country, someone else will. So it might as well be you, and you might as well bring some measure of benevolence to your imperialism, your imposition of your own resources, institutions, and sovereignty over the land of someone else's, right? Without their consent. That if you're going to barge in on somebody, you might as well help them out. And they went so far as saying that this was the white man's noblesse oblige, his nobleman's obligation, because he was in a better situation, more civilized, more industrialized, more technologically up to speed, and militarily up to speed, that he was actually doing a favor to these primitive Pacific Island countries, Caribbean countries that he was colonizing by catching them up to speed, and teaching them the ways of civilization so that they would not become gobbled up by someone else in the future or in the near future. So it says here, beliefs like this were not only espoused in universities and government chambers, but they also became publicly embraced by a large and somewhat credulous, easily believing what they read, reading public. All right. And so then that brings us to the Spanish-American War. Let's see here. Sorry, I want to look and see what number this is. Okay, we're still on number 1. So adherence to these beliefs. So supposedly Teddy Roosevelt was an adherent to these types of beliefs. Several secretaries of state by the US government adhered to these beliefs. And the Secretary of State had a lot of say, as did the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as to what we did with our foreign policy. So these people in great positions of power, it's hard to avoid great man history when you do this topic. You're looking at, Cabot Lodge and Henry Cabot Lodge and these other expansionists who were in the Senate and got to make these decisions about intervening in these foreign countries. President Teddy Roosevelt, et cetera, et cetera. They quoted Mahan, Nietzsche, Malthus, and these other intellectuals of their time. All right. And so let's see here. The Spanish-American War. As you'll see, there is evidence that what court history tries to do is tries to contend, remember, because court history praises the US and the winners of US history and the leaders of US history. And so they can't deny that we got involved in Cuba and Puerto Rico and in the Philippines, right? And Guam, taking those island countries in the Spanish-American War of 1898. But what they can contend is that we were pushed into it, that we were a hesitant bully, right? Who didn't initially want to get involved, but we eventually did, almost begrudgingly. Well, you get a little bit of that history in this book here. So some of the books that I would recommend, this one's a little court, however, but this is Ivan Musikant, Empire by Default, on the Spanish-American War. That's a pretty good book. If you want to look at revisionist history, that's really tough on the US, kind of assumes that there was somewhat of a plutocracy, kind of a combination of big business and government leaders who were in on it to scratch one another's backs and at the expense of smaller, weaker countries, and go in exploitative fashion to take new lands over. I would recommend almost any book by Walter Lefebvre. This one, The New Empire, is just one of many that he has written on the topic. But again, Walter Lefebvre. Then I think this is a very balanced book on self-interest, so hence revisionist history in the Philippines, coupled with genuine condescending beliefs by the Americans that they were in there to also not just enrich themselves and our country, but to also help the Filipino people out. Is H.W. Brands, which I've mentioned him before. Bound to Empire is a good book, a pretty balanced book on that topic. So at any rate, going back to the Empire by Default book, is it's a little bit court, and then it contends that there was a lot of pressure put upon 2 presidents in a row. First, President Grover Cleveland, then William McKinley after him, to get involved to help the Cubans out, to overthrow the Spanish out of their island. Because as you may recall from other history classes, from around 1810, when Napoleon had taken over Spain, through the 1820s, most of Latin America broke free from Spain and became independent. So modern day countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, Mexico, Guatemala, etc. Right? But there were exceptions. Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. Philippines are in Asia, but they too were colonized by Spain. Guam, they were still held by the Spanish as late as 1898. And so they tried to fight free in the 1870s to no avail, and they tried again in 1895. And so in Cuba in particular, you have evidence of Cuban organizations known as juntas developing in Florida and in New York in the United States, trying to foment popular empathy for the Cuban plight, to try to get Americans to sympathize with the Cubans and want to help them break free from the yoke of Spanish colonization, of Spanish imperialism over them. And so for 3 years, it didn't work, right? With Grover Cleveland, et cetera, even to the point of problems like arson. There was guerrilla warfare, right? Guerrilla literally means little warfare. There was guerrilla warfare, and they began putting each other's plantations on fire. Those who joined the rebel cause versus those who stayed loyal to Spain in the Cuban island. And some people there were dual citizens, had dual citizenship in Cuba and in the United States. And our 5th and 14th Amendment state that Americans' lives, liberty, and property are to be protected. Does that mean overseas as well? It depends upon what administration is interpreting it. And so at El Galeon, rebel leaders of the Cuban cause to break free from Spain, they actually considered creating arson, committing arson to damage the properties of dual citizens, to drag America into the war. So America would say, you know what, our dual citizens are losing their property. We need to do something about it. But it did not work. Grover Cleveland said he would not reward arson, and that American dual citizens basically invested in the island of Cuba at their own peril, and the U.S. would not get involved. And he left office under that note. So he refrained from getting involved. And with McKinley, instead of depicting him as a warmonger, this book depicts him as a weakling who was ironically didn't have the backbone to refuse to join the Spanish-American War, but instead was sucked into it almost against his will. And you have evidence of senators decrying that we will declare war in spite of him, referencing President McKinley. You have the famous De Lomé letter, and the De Lomé letter from a Spanish diplomat to another stated, I doubt the American will get involved because he doesn't have much of a backbone. And so you have that go across the newspapers, etc. And that put extraordinary pressure on McKinley because according to a very interesting book, it stated that there was a zeitgeist, there was a spirit of the age of the 1890s that was so interlocked with social Darwinism and machismo, being manly, being aggressive, and having those Darwinian virtues of fighting and surviving and thriving, that it was basically political suicide for a politician at that time period to look like a weakling. So there was evidence that there was a lot of pressure put upon McKinley to join this war, or else he would be seen as a weakling and would not win re-election. Because of course he was worried about re-election, not having, you know, any idea that he was going to be assassinated before that could happen anyway. And so yellow journalism played a part. Yellow journalism depicted the Spaniards as awful. They even named one guy Valeriano Weyler, the butcher, and he put native Cubans in these concentration camps, many of whom died of malnutrition and starvation, etc., in those barbed wire camps. And so the newspapers just ran with it. Hearst newspapers and others and his competitors. So then supposedly ensued a turnabout in American public opinion when it's the beginning of taking modern light polls, and they contend that American public began to fully support helping Cuba, the cause of a free Cuba, of Cuba Libre. And so now he's got the public behind his back, pushing him as president, the supposedly spineless, hesitant bully, Mr. McKinley. And so then from there, you have the case of the blowing up of the Maine. There was a Havana bull rider, a Spanish bull rider that came to Havana, Cuba, and the native Cuban rebels issued a lot of pamphlets and propaganda for the international clientele that came to watch this bullfight in Cuba, saying, see how the Spaniards are treating us, help out the free Cuba cause, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Spanish authorities in Havana just cracked down on this underground group, busted heads, made mass arrests, shot into a crowd, etc. So at that time, finally, McKinley says, you know what, I'm going to just issue a show of force to remind the Spaniards they better be on their best behavior, that we have American citizens here in Cuba as well. So we sent in the USS Maine, and it was there for about 6 weeks. And it was very awkward while this battleship was there in the Havana harbor, and then it mysteriously blows up. Our naval scuba expedition decides that it has found evidence that an external source, hence a Spanish source or mine, had caused the explosion. And the Spanish scuba force came up with evidence of an internal implosion, that it was completely an accident and it was the Americans' fault. And so to this day, I don't know if there's consensus. But with the death of the men on the Maine, supposedly President McKinley still stated, I don't propose to be swept off my feet. He still refused to join the fray, even after the Maine blew up. But then he does something that's rather interesting and mysterious, is he issues, right, an ultimatum. Let's see here. He paradoxically issued an ultimatum to Spain that he had to have known could and would never be met, and hence would lead to war. He gave Spain a set date by which she must either crush the Cuban rebellion, which she had failed to do in 3 years, or come to an agreement with Cuban rebels, which again, McKinley should have known was impossible. Spanish politicians simply letting glorious and profitable colonies go would be tantamount to political suicide, and Cuban leaders immediately announced their demand for nothing short of complete independence. And so they tried a half measure. They had parliamentary elections in Spain. Prajedes Sagasta, a liberal, and his liberal party took over parliament. They removed the hated butcher, Valeriano Weyler, and put in Ramon Blanco, who was much less controversial and severe. They also offered limited autonomy to these people in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, and in Cuba. so that they could have virtually run their own domestic government, but have their armed forces and their foreign policy still dictated by Spain. And what's interesting is the leaders of Puerto Rico passed it, accepted it. They accepted this thing. So you know where I'm going with this is, then why did we go to Puerto Rico to free the Puerto Ricans if they had already made their own agreement with the Spanish of their own volition, that they were willing to pretty much share power with the Spanish as long as they could virtually be autonomous over their own domestic issues and institutions. And so that's interesting. And then the Philippines, you don't have the same degree of, you don't have the same evidence of them reaching out to the Americans to elicit our empathy and elicit our help as you do find from the Cubans. Because Jose Marti of the Cuban Revolution, he rightfully had reservations about asking us to help. He was afraid that once we came into the proverbial home of Cuba and helped kick out the Spaniards, that we ourselves would refuse to leave after that. Very similar reticence made by Emilio Aguinaldo and the leaders of the Katipunan organization of the Philippines. But nevertheless, we went to the Philippines to fight supposedly for them to kick out the Spanish, but they didn't really invite us to, right? The only place where we could remotely make an argument that our help had been sought out would be Cuba. But Puerto Rico made its own agreement with Spain, and the Philippines just didn't ask us. But we went to the Philippines and we went to Puerto Rico as well during the Spanish-American War, not just to help the Cubans. And whose decision was that? That was a decision made ultimately by the President McKinley, the same McKinley who didn't want to get involved in this fight. So what an enigma, right? What a puzzle of a man. Who really was this McKinley gentleman? So at any rate, we intervened and we did stay, just as they had feared. And then to make matters worse, at Malolos in the Philippines, the Katipunan organization and others devised a federal constitutional republic. Does that sound familiar? That's what we have, modeled largely after ours. We said, no, you're not ready for it. Sorry, you're not ready for that type of self-government. You need our tutelage. You need us to tutor you. Number 4 shows just naked aggression and just very aggressive geopolitics or realpolitik. I'm going to use these interchangeably, okay? Realpolitik, geopolitics. To me, right? That's when you unapologetically adhere to a lot of the beliefs that I've already mentioned in this video. Social Darwinism, Nietzsche, Malthus, Alfred Thayer Mahan, right? And contend unapologetically that you are going to aggressively ensure American self-interest. And if it has to be at the expense of other weaker nations, then so be it. So for instance, you deal with contingencies, with what ifs. You look at the map like a chessboard and you say, okay, the British are in Nicaragua. What if they come further up into the Caribbean, close to Florida? What should we do? Well, we should be sure that we have a hand, a manipulatively strong hand over all the Caribbean countries to make that impossible for England to do. The Germans are in Samoan Islands. Then we need to get the Hawaiian Islands and make sure that we check them out there in the Pacific. We need to have Midway in the middle of the Pacific for the same reason, and watch the Pacific as our backyard to ensure that German Samoa can't ever become a threat to us. But in getting involved in the Hawaiian Islands to put a check on German overtures in Samoa, right? You don't take no for an answer from the Hawaiians. You let them know that you demand, you make demands. We want only a naval yard for the U.S. Navy and no other Navy. We want coal, which the ships ran on, to be sold only to American ships and not to any other foreign ships. And we're going to make the Polynesian leaders of Hawaii promise such. So that's what geopolitics or realpolitik is somewhat about, from what I understand, is that you deal with the what ifs and you aggressively make sure that you have a strong power and interest over countries that are considered geographically significant on the map, right? In case of future threats or conflicts. But you don't allow those smaller island countries to say no to you. You impose your will if you have to upon them. So it's a very ugly, amoral type of foreign policy that we're talking about. Okay. And then number 5, present censure of American imperialism in the Philippines ought to be mitigated by the presence of some good intentions. So now I'm taking a 180 and I'm saying, but we just really believe this stuff. And we really did partially believe that we were doing the Filipinos and the Puerto Ricans a favor. So look at some of this. Moreover, as progressives primarily deferred to the biologists and other scientists of their day, they broadly accepted the following as orthodox truth. In the racial classification of humans along an alleged chart of exospecies evolution, so hence how far each, quote, race had evolved from its primate ancestors. In the assessment that Nordic, Caucasian, and Teutonic people from Western and Northern Europe were the furthest evolved, while others like the Celtic or Celtic, the Mongoloid, the Iberian, and Iberian is Hispanic, right? And African were less so, and so forth and so forth. So you see there, furthermore, while some progressives like Fighting Bob La Follette of Wisconsin fought against imperialism, many embraced the alleged scientific assumptions of their era. The social Darwinist assumption that imperialism is a normal facet of life and that nations must act aggressively in their foreign policy or suffer the aggression of others. And then it goes on with the others that I've already described. So consequently, it fell completely within the progressive worldview for progressive era U.S. administrations to do the following: enter a war with Spain to help liberate the Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans from Spanish colonization, remain in Puerto Rico and the Philippines long after the Spanish-American War, carry out paternalistic rule in such island countries, initiating improvements while keeping the native politicians subordinated to American officials. Now, this was not simply a pretext for taking advantage of the Latino people. Granted, the U.S. administration created an environment in which big business could and did reap great profits in and from these island nations. But American progressive leaders seem to genuinely believe in the following: that the Spanish-American War was chivalric, that the island people were not yet ready for self-rule, and that the U.S. was saving these developing countries from becoming gobbled up by other foes and by the march of progress. So look what William Willoughby wrote about the tendency of Puerto Ricans. The more highly educated classes of the population show little, if any, desire to subordinate selfish ends to public considerations. So he's saying most of the well-to-do Puerto Rican officials put their own self-interest above what's best for the general public. After centuries of effort to create such a public opinion, success has only been partially achieved. It is not remarkable, therefore, that when we turn to a country such as Puerto Rico, inhabited by persons having none of the traditions of self-government behind them, with temperaments more excitable, with the custom of valuing immediate rather than ultimate results, and with a characteristic firmly ingrained in them of emphasizing personal, family, and other considerations at the expense of public interest, to find that these fundamental bases of real democratic self-government should be largely lacking. So notice, right? He's stating that by nature and by nurture, Puerto Ricans are not ready to rule themselves. Says, first of all, they're more excitable. Boy, that's an old Latino stereotype, right? The passionate Latin who can't control his urges, can't control his passions, can't control his anger, and gets all worked up and does not do some of the following. And look at what he says they ought to do. They must learn and expect self-restraint, tolerance, and obedience. They must expect their politicians to practice civic virtue rather than self-aggrandizement and party enrichment. They must learn to respect election results. They must begin to adhere to rational politics, which entails adherence to political platforms and policies rather than to individuals and their parties. And they must not tolerate political machines and bosses. So again, believing that the Latino or Iberian people were not as far evolved as Anglo-Saxon Americans, right? He contended that they lack self-control, these passionate Latinos in Puerto Rico. If someone wins an election, they don't abide by it. They can't take it. They rise up in arms and they don't recognize the election results. When someone's running for office, they blindly follow men rather than policies. And when they get in power, they enrich themselves and their own families rather than do what's best for the common good of the people that they govern. And he says, by nature, they do this because, again, they're less evolved Latinos who are overly passionate, but by nurture, because the Spanish have taught them these bad habits. And the good news is, according to some of the progressives, is what the Puerto Ricans have learned wrongly, they can, quote, unlearn. So literally they use the term tutelage. America will hold the Puerto Ricans by the hand, will share power in Puerto Rico with them, will develop infrastructure of public school system and other types of improvements for the people on the island for their own good. Americans will have veto power over the Puerto Ricans, but allow them to have some offices that they could serve until they can prove that they can govern with civic virtue. And that goes back to Rome, Tacitus, Cicero, that they could put their self-control in check, their passions in check, and do what's best for Puerto Rico itself rather than for themselves. And here's suggestions. build a public school system and infrastructure, and help agricultural industries, treat Puerto Rico as the U.S. had pre-state territories, but permit political participation for the Puerto Rican elite. Look at this. He likened permission for Puerto Ricans to jointly rule their island to a father allowing his child to get into the water to learn to swim. And it's the same virtual story when it comes to the Philippines. Commissioners were put over the Philippine Islands, American commissioners, obviously. Tutelage and protection is what they offered the Filipino people. So notice how paternalistic that is. We're your father figure. We're your wise father figure who will teach you the ways of governing. The Filipino people are as incapable of self-government as children. And you have here the Sherman Commission brought educated American intellectuals to come over and establish a school system and up-to-date institutions in the Philippines. Remember the white man's burden? We're supposedly carrying that out for these, quote, backward, childlike Filipinos. And then here, the American occupiers permitted a Filipino national legislator to be elected, known as the Assembly. Many posts went to native Filipinos at the local level. Regional governors were elected, as were city council members, and one member of a provincial board. The other two members were American handpicked guys. This was clearly a paternalistic endeavor, allowing them some self-government, but having American veto power over them. So city council were run by the indigenous Filipinos and Puerto Ricans. The provincial or state level was jointly run by elected Filipinos and Puerto Ricans with American commissioners with veto power over them. At the national level, an assembly was created of elected Filipinos and Puerto Ricans in their respective countries. But there was an American council that had veto power over the assembly. And it went by a system of rewards and punishments. And then the insular cases decided that full American rights do not necessarily have to follow the American flag. Because the liberals of the time were saying, hey, if the American flag goes over foreign soil, then those people are now ought to be treated as Americans with the same rights that that flag brings us. In the insular cases, they decided no, that they could handpick what rights, what opportunities the people could and could not have. To this day, you guys, Puerto Rico as a territory under the US, not a state, they could have one elected Puerto Rican come to Congress, but he has no vote. So talk about an awkward situation to this very day. We did allow oppositional parties in the Philippines and Puerto Rico to rise up against the Americans within the system. And we allowed by elections that competition to ensue. So the point being on this last one, right, is by today's standards, this is all awful. Just brutal condescension, right? But the point being is that we genuinely believed it. The progressives really thought they were doing what was best for the Filipino and Puerto Rican people. Notice I'm just mentioning them because Guam just became a military island, and Cuba we left in 1902. We stayed there 4 years, 1898 to 1902, and then left as promised. So do you have any questions, Jasmine?
Yeah, so we're gonna be writing about what we've read, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, is there are we supposed, is there a specific way of how long it should be?
No, that's a good question. I'll go ahead and think about that, and I'll write it on the assignment itself, okay?
Okay.
But I'd like it to be close to a page, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like it to be about a page.
Okay.
But no, that's a good question, as I've not made that clear. All right, anything else, Jasmine? You okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Good. I'm glad to have you back. And so, yeah, I mean, that's it, unless you have any specific questions.
I think that was it. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, you will certainly get your extra credit. Okay, Jasmine, I appreciate you coming, especially the last few times you've been the only one. I'm very proud of you and appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
All right. So have a good week. Okay. And good luck with this assignment.
Okay, thank you. Have a good week.
You too. Take care.
Will you be posting the assignment, right?
Yes, I'll be posting it as soon as this downloads.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.